Okay, so I just want to, again, bring us back into the conference. I want to turn us over to Jamil Jaffer, who has become a great colleague of mine since I joined Scalia Law School. He's an assistant professor there and also the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute, which we're just delighted that we could start partnering between CPIP and some of the other great centers at Scalia Law School. Jamil and I share a lot of common interests together in the tech space, innovation, entrepreneurship. And so we were just really thrilled that we could put this together. So they have been a co-host of us with this conference. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jamil to run this afternoon's final panel for our conference.
Awesome. Well, Sean, thank you so much for having me host this panel. I'm excited to do it. Excited about the partnership with CPIP and the great work that you all are doing here at the Scalia Law School with us. I can't emphasize how important the work you're doing in the intellectual property space and how important that work is in the current environment as we think about the threat posed by China in the national security arena, but particularly in the technology space, as well as other actors, and the importance of innovation to the American economy. So I'm glad to be here with you today, and I'm glad for the partnership. I'm Jamil Jaffer, founder and executive director of NSI, as Sean just said, and we're excited to be partnering with CPIP on this effort. The panel we're talking about today is entitled Technology Leadership in 5G and IoT Markets. We're going to be focused on the competition between the U.S. and China in various fields of next-gen technology and the impact that competition has on law, policy, and innovation. One quick reminder before we get started, if you'd like to get CLE credit for attending today's panel, please use the following password. I'll get your pens out now because it's a long one. It's RMJ MJ Leader. So again, RMJ MJ Leader. And that's if you want to get CLE credit for today's panel. We've got a great group of experts with us today discussing these issues. You have their bios in your material, so I won't be doing lengthy introductions here, but I'm excited to be joined by Megan Brown, NSI Senior Fellow and a partner at Wiley Ryan, Andy Kaiser, NSI Fellow and former Senior Advisor to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Andy is in pinch hitting for our mutual former boss, Congressman Mike Rogers, who was the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He unfortunately had a last-minute obligation come up and wasn't able to join us, but thank you, Andy, for jumping in. Dr. Jonathan Putnam, founder and principal of Competition Dynamics. And of course, last but certainly not least, the Honorable Judge Randy Rader, former Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. So thank you to the panel for being here. I'd like to start by talking about China and the issues that we have in this space. Dr. Putnam, you've recently been working on some research on a quantitative analysis of China domestic patents over the past 2 decades. Can you talk to us about your initial findings and what they reveal about the quality and quantity of Chinese patents in this space?
Yes, I circulated a paper on this, and I think that it's probably worth just making a brief reference to that. The basic point is this: China subsidizes patent applications. And so as with other things that are subsidized, if you subsidize them, you get more of them. And China now produces by far the most number of patents in the world. And that's being used rhetorically to advance the narrative that China has come to dominate and surpass all the other economies of the world in innovation, both in 5G as well as in other technologies. So a question that I and my co-authors asked was, is that actually true? Is that true? And the basic framework that we you brought to bear on this was, if you think of there being a single global production function for innovation, which there is, since innovations are defined relative to everybody else in the world, given the resources that China actually devotes to innovation, what would be the number of patents you would expect them to produce, given the rate at which others produce patents? So I'm just going to give a brief tour of the argument and conclusions. I'll share my screen. Hang on just one second. Okay, so what we have on the screen right here is a graph of applications per year by region, where the world is broken up into 4 regions: China, the US, Europe, and the rest of the world. And you can see that the big outlier is China, where patent applications have grown from essentially 0 in 2000 to about 1.4 million in the year 2018. So that's the phenomenon that we're investigating. What's the reason for that? Well, if you look at a similar graph, which is applications per researcher in China, you see basically the same picture. Applications per researcher are mostly flat in the rest of the world, but they have gone from, again, close to 0 to almost patent application per person per year by 2018. The question is that believable? So there are things that are happening in China that are causing China to increase its innovative output. So for example, GDP per capita income is increasing in China, but you can see it's also increasing in the United States. So that can't be the entire source of the increase. That graph doesn't look like the other ones. Similarly, the share of national product that China devotes to R&D is rapidly increasing. In the year 2000, it was below 1%, whereas now it's reached the rest of the world average, which is slightly above 2%, although not as high as the United States, which is about 2.8%. So that also can't be the explanation. So we developed an econometric model to actually look at these factors and then say, how many patents would we predict for China, given its actual inputs of R&D, population, gross national product, and the other macro determinants of inventive behavior? And the answer to that is that our model actually predicts the actual data very well. It captures this sharply increasing line if you allow China to be different from the rest of the world. But if you say that China must look like the rest of the world in the way that researchers yield applications and that additional resources, additional output like GDP produce applications, then the counterfactual experiment shows that China's out in production of innovations should be something more like between 200 and 300,000 patents per year in the year 2018. So long story short, the quantity of Chinese patents is vastly overstated. And I'll put up a complicated graph, which I won't try to explain. It's in the paper. The gist of it says, what's the ratio of the quality of Chinese patents to the quality of the rest of the world's patents, given that you have this subsidy and this massive increase in quantity? And the answer is, based on the axis you see on the left-hand side, you can make different assumptions, but somewhere around 3%. Chinese quality is about 3% of the patents in the rest of the world. So there's been a massive increase in quantity, a massive decrease in quality, and those effects are largely offsetting, with the result that this subsidy program means that Chinese innovative output is not much different from what you would expect it to be if there were no subsidies at all, and you had many fewer patents, but many higher quality patents. So that's really the conclusion.
Yeah, interesting, Dr. Putnam. So this is an interesting point, and I'm interested in Judge Rader's thoughts on this. So Judge Rader, you previously said, there's a real commitment to intellectual property in China. Given what we've just seen from Dr. Putnam and this issue of quantity versus quality, how do you see the IP situation in China today? And do you think that it really is a level playing field today between the U.S. and China when it comes to the topic of this panel, IoT and 5G patents?
Yeah, the problem, I greatly commend Dr. Putnam for his research. Most of that is common knowledge, that indeed, as you subsidize something, the component he didn't put in there is they also have quotas. The Chinese system is the only one in the world where the ministers at the cabinet level will be calling local mayors and officials saying, you haven't met your quota for patent applications. What's wrong with you? They are intensely motivated by innovation, and they count it in terms of numbers. Well, when you require numbers, of course, people are going to file a great many patents, many of them of very low quality. And indeed, the utility model, which is a low quality, something like a picture patent, a design application, not even examined, are the bulk of the numbers of Chinese innovation. The thing that you would need to account for, though, is this is across the whole Chinese economy. There are legitimate international level corporations within China who have made vast contributions. The most notable, of course, is Huawei. And I think it's fair to say that they have made contributions to the 5G standards that are equivalent or nearly equivalent to Qualcomm, which is the leader in American technological advance. And so to look at the overall numbers and say China's doing about like the rest of the world is good, but it doesn't account for the fact that China has its Qualcomms too, and has its leaders, And those leaders are having a major impact on world technology growth. They also have as diverse a technology community as the United States. There are Xiaomi's and Lenovo's just like there are Apples and Google's. There are WeChats and Alibaba's just like there are Amazon's. They have a diverse technology community making substantial contributions. So while we can say as a whole, the numbers game doesn't really distinguish China, what has distinguished China is the emergence of these world-class players in the technology community.
Yeah. Megan, were you going to jump in on Dr. Putnam's point?
No.
So Andy, question for you then, coming off of Judge Rader's point. So, you know, I've always understood the challenge with some of these Chinese companies, Huawei, ZTE and the like, to be partly that they're building on the backs of American technology that was stolen by the Chinese government, right? At least that's the claim that we've heard made extensively, including by a report released by the House Intelligence Committee back when you were there under Chairman Rogers. And there's also been this larger sort of claim about, you know, this idea that, you know, there's a larger threat here posed by what may be Chinese innovation, but may also just be an effort to sort of box out other innovation happening through the execution of a large number of patents. Talk to us about what you see as the national security threat in this space. And then I really want to bring Megan on the conversation about regulation and innovation here in the U.S. So Andy, talk to us about the national security threat, though, as you see it posed by the Chinese in this space.
Sure. Well, nice to be on with y'all this afternoon, and happy to fill in for the boss. It feels like the old days, Jamil, when we would have to fill in for a member of Congress. So happy to do it this afternoon, and great to be on with distinguished panel. So a couple of thoughts. One, so how do they do it, and what is the national security threat? Before we kick over to Megan, I do think it's important to keep in mind China operates like no other country on earth in their technology space, where yes, they have a history of stealing research and development, buying what they can't steal, and legitimately conducting some significant research and development on their own in recent years. But they also couple that with the second largest economy in the world being largely a captured market. So they have an ability to lock out competitors. They have an ability to set quotas for domestic champions, so-called champions under Chinese law. They have an ability to add tariffs to competitors. They provide their Chinese champions with endless lines of credit from state banks, unlike any of their competitors. So you couple all that together, they conduct a predatory economics with allies and trading partners around the world. When you add all that up, including state-sponsored research and development directly, add all that up, that's a pretty compelling case for advancing these companies' interests, right? So the U.S. doesn't do all of those things. We do, some of those things piecemeal. Europe doesn't do much of it at all. South Korea a bit, Japan a bit, but the scale is just so vast. I mean, I think back to ZTE when they were first added to the entity list, which interestingly enough, they have been removed and are still removed, by the way. When they're added to the entity list, the Bank of China floated them a $15 billion line of credit. Now, imagine if that situation had happened to Cisco or Oracle or any other US company, we just wouldn't be in a position to do that, nor would we. So that's number one. I do think it's important to understand the context of how these companies are flourishing, and the previous analysts are right. They are, and they're commanding significant market share, and are making some contributions on the development innovation side as well now that their engineers have learned the tricks of the trade. So the threat, a lot has been written on this. Jamil, you mentioned the 2012 report. There was actually, I commend all the listeners, a very damning UK House of Commons report that was issued this week, yesterday, which in my view is the most damning report that we've seen, official government report, since that 2012 report. I mean, for the Brits, it's pretty biting. And the Brits are, remember, 50% of their infrastructure today is Huawei. They have extensive trading relationship with Beijing. They have, certainly, we obviously are intertwined economically, but the UK is in a unique way, a lot of ownership of business and land and other things in the UK that we might not see here.
Right.
So all of that to get to the threat. So clearly the threat folks like you and I worried about back in those days and continue to write about is if the economy of the future is going to be a digital one where innovation is prized, and we're traveling with autonomous vehicles, and we're conducting telemedicine. And the thing that powers all of that is this telecommunications infrastructure.
Right.
Couple that with the importance of military intelligence applications and things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing. If those pipes are being run, owned, and can be tapped into, disrupted by our biggest geopolitical competitor on the planet, that's not a good position for any power to find itself.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So, Megan, we've heard from now Dr. Putnam about the sort of quality and quantity of Chinese patents. Judge Rader tells us there's a lot of innovation going on, and he admits there's innovation happening in China and successful innovation, but that it's built on sort of this potential threat to U.S. national security. American lawmakers seem to have gotten a sense for there's a potential problem here. In some ways, this challenge we've seen in supply chain when it comes to PPE and pharmaceuticals have really highlighted that issue for American consumers, in the COVID experience. And so, as a result, U.S. regulators have started to get involved in this space and sort of have started thinking about what government intervention in 5G and IoT might look like. And your work sort of focuses you with your clients on some of the cutting edge of that. Talk to us about how you see the potential for government regulation in the 5G and IoT space, and whether and what impact it'll have on American and foreign business.
I mean, my concerns really are that we run this risk of responding to all of the valid points that we've heard thus far in a way that takes us away from our sort of values about how we promote innovation, as well as it's right now very fragmented. A GAO report came out yesterday criticizing the administration's implementation of a 5G strategy, and I think that hit a lot of what we see. There's a multiplicity of efforts on 5G that are coming about as a result of this impulse from which is well-founded, that we need to address security in these technologies. But the question from my perspective is sort of what tools you bring to bear, and do you accidentally become that which you dislike, right? Like the urge to nationalize 5G, I think is utterly wrongheaded, and having sort of the embracing the concept of national champions is sort of fighting on the field that we perceive China to be fighting on. And quite frankly, if we were to say we're going to pump US R&D to try and match what China's doing, there's not the political will to do that. So I think we have to stop and think, how do we rationalize our regulations? How do we pursue targeted regulation, if at all, that is non-disruptive? I mean, just looking at what the US government has going on today, right now, dealing with sort of the Huawei and China supply chain issues, you've got implementation of the National Defense Authorization Act through 889, which has been very challenging for the private sector. You've got the State Department confusing the heck out of people with its Clean Path, Clean Network thing that people don't really know what that ultimately means. The Federal Communications Commission has multiple things underway. Commerce Department has many, many lines in the water on this. You've got executive orders that pop out on WeChat, TikTok. And I think we may be overlooking in our rush or our zeal to address these legitimate security issues. I don't want to jump over the very good private innovation that's ongoing. You've got the carriers and the manufacturers have labs. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff, thinking going on about cross-border transatlantic R&D for some of the key 5G inputs. And so I think whenever you've got this, what I view as a bipartisan alliance to address a problem, I'm concerned that we have so many things going on that it's fragmented, it's a little bit duplicative, and you may have creeping regulation and a role for government that might not be consistent with how we have typically done technology innovation, right? From my understanding, the perspective that the narrative of U.S. dominance in the tech sector for the past 20 to 30 years is because of a conscious decision by Congress to take a light touch to technology innovation and allow us to own and run the table as a place where innovation is going to happen. If you start putting up walls in the form of export controls to try and keep our technology here, I think you're going to find technology moves overseas and we end up losing out on that. So my big picture concern is maybe a bit of an unrealistic goal in cleaning the world's pipes, and concern that we're rushing too far down some regulatory paths that might not ultimately benefit U.S. innovation.
Yeah. No, so that's an interesting point, Megan. You know, this sort of idea that we're sort of going too far and we're actually manipulating the markets in a way that it's actually going to harm innovation, undermine innovation. Andy, I know you're gonna have thoughts on this, and I'm sure Dr. Putnam will have thoughts too. But I want to go to Judge Rader. Judge Rader, what do you make of that? Do you think that's Megan is right that we're overestimating the threat posed by China, or maybe not overestimating it, but responding to it in the wrong way, right? And that is to say, actually harming innovation by thinking about this idea of national champions, by playing their game, if that is their game, in fact, that we are actually going to undermine the very thing that has created American innovation, which is a light touch regulatory environment.
You know, I like for us to recognize that this is a legitimate competitive position we're in. I wish I could take all of you to China and show you 50,000 Huawei engineers working on AI and 5G technology. And I could bring to your attention that they invest 15% of their gross budget in R&D, not the 2% that you have China-wide. So this is not a question of subsidies and state-owned enterprises, which indeed can have an impact in some of the smaller entities, but the major competitors are legitimate competition. And I worry that we dismiss it as something built on unfair conduct, which may have happened 20 years ago. It to my eyes, hasn't happened very much in recent years, and we tend to dismiss it, and that colors our perception of the legitimate competitive threat, which I think your general 5G standard setting would say that Huawei is an equal contributor to that, along with Qualcomm. And that's not because of unfair competition. That's because they invest more and do more research.
Well, what about that, Andy? Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Judge. So Andy, what about that? I mean, Judge Rader says, look, it's fair competition now. Even if they did steal stuff back in the day, or the Chinese government stole stuff and gave it to them, that was 20 years ago. Huawei's got a ton of people doing innovation. You even said yourself that there is some significant innovation taking place in some of these companies. Is that right? Is this really sort of now a fair marketplace? And we're just sour grapes. We're losing. They're doing better, and we're just upset, and we're going to try and now stack the market the way Megan says. That's actually going to harm innovation, and we're going to try and beat them at their own game, which is going to be unsuccessful. Is that right, Andy? What's your view?
Two things. So as to recent conduct, there have been a number of cases where there have been accused and proven to conducting espionage. There was a case, the T-Mobile case here in the U.S., the Justice Department indictment pending, where the
jury found 0 damages in that case. They found that, yes, there had been a problem. By the way, it was a little rubber finger on a testing device, which hardly is advanced technology. And they found that the Huawei engineer had put it in his pocket, thinking it wasn't technology that he couldn't take. But when the jury came around to see if that trade secret violation had any value, the damages was 0. And how a Justice Department can bring a criminal case when the civil damages were 0 is hard for me to understand. You mentioned the wrong case.
Well, those cases are still pending, and you put more faith in the CCP plan than I do, I suppose.
No, I just know the case.
Well, that's what they could bring into a U.S. court of law. So that's what was
They
brought.
did. They won. They had 0 damages. That's the point. The U.S. court of law determined no damages.
There was the case in Poland where 2 human assets were Huawei employees were arrested, and that case is ongoing as well. You have multiple U.S. government reports citing their active espionage. So I don't think it's a moot point at this juncture. And then you have the most important issue really is a question of trust, and particularly these networks. So not necessarily the handheld devices or the individual laptops or some of the technology that Huawei is in on that side, but if you have to be able to trust the vendors who are operating these telecommunications networks. There's just no way around it. They have to be able to patch. They have to be able to update. And there's a reason why the rest of the world has come to the conclusion that Huawei is not to be trusted in their networks.
And I think,
So, Dr.
Andy,
no, go ahead, Megan, please.
I was just going to say that the question from my perspective, just to expand a little on my point earlier, is assume that is the case, right? Let's assume, right, that there is serious and significant questions about the trustworthiness of equipment and network architecture. To me, the more interesting question is then, as a policy matter and as a legal matter, what do we do about that? And
Right.
The question to me is, do you risk sort of overcorrecting? Do you insert the government too much into innovation? And sort of are the government's goals realistic sometimes when you look at, say, the attempt to impose by regulation fixes to the extraterritorial networks that communications necessarily will traverse in the global economy. And that really, to me, is the question that I think Jamil's trying to get at, that I think is really interesting, is what should the U.S. government do? Let's not litigate whether they're a security threat. We can take that as table stakes. And then going from there, what does it look like? What is the U.S. response that should be calibrated to that?
Yeah, so Dr. Putnam, I want to know if your research has any data on these questions, and in particular, there's a question from the audience about whether there's been a shift in Chinese patent applications since the onset of COVID-19. I realize the data you have, I know, goes back 2018, but if you've heard or seen any sort of atmospherics about whether that's changing, obviously we know that production is shifting, or there's at least a discussion of shifting production to the United States or other countries, to their home countries away from China. Are you seeing any sort of similar trends in the patent data? I realize that it's newer data. Anything like that, or anything that your research might shed on this question of whether, in fact, this innovation is built on the backs of stolen technology?
Well, there's objection compound, counselor. So I guess I would say several things. One is I don't have any data that reflects patent applications since COVID-19, and I wouldn't really trust it because I think it's still too recent of a phenomenon to make long-term prognostications about. Secondly, the data does actually have some things to say about Chinese quality and its impact worldwide. So, for example, one of the key metrics is not actually domestic application, but patenting abroad. And so a further aspect of the model we haven't discussed is the extent to which China is able to obtain patents abroad to protect its own inventions. And by that key metric, China is expanding, but not nearly as much as you would expect. And since applications abroad are an indicator of quality, again, the conclusion would be that China is not influencing the world economy in the way that you would expect, given the level of quote unquote domestic innovation that we're observing. But I do think that the more interesting question which Megan has raised, and I think it's worth trying to bring to bear a little bit of economics on that question, is what is the role of government in this competition? Because as Judge Rader says, there is legitimate competition, and without speaking about any company in particular, since I often find myself in litigation with them, there is no question that there are substantial resources being devoted in China to real innovation. I think that's quite true, but there's also no question that the Chinese government is willing to intervene in the process in a way that the US government is not. So one thing that I would suggest as an economist is that there are several dimensions in which the United States government could demonstrate both leadership worldwide and the protection of domestic interests that don't involve the kind of narrow industrial policy and national champion raising or subsidizing that we observe in China. For example, I think that the United States has actually shows itself badly divided in its understanding of the legitimate antitrust theory that should be brought to bear in global markets. And even its antitrust agencies can't articulate a common view of what a proper price ought to be or what a proper way of licensing technology ought to be. They are basically at each other's throats in the telecom sector. And that division plays into the larger difference between innovators and innovators, where China is still a net implementer. The division between innovators and implementers, and China is still a net implementer. And so that division in the United States actually helps China. I think that should be resolved. A second aspect would be intervening as a country in unfair trade. Contrary to Judge Rader, I have actually testified recently in multiple trade secret theft cases at the International Trade Commission, in which in each case, a Chinese company was found liable for having stolen U.S. technology in a wide variety of sectors. And this is only just the tip of the iceberg. The Section 301 reports actually show a much broader pattern of this. I don't think that Chinese telecom technology is built on theft. I think they're investing too much to say they stole it all from us. That's just not true. But on the other hand, to say that they steal systematically is also true. So the third point I think that an economist would point to in terms of helping U.S. interests as well as global interests is that a lot of the innovation that we see is built on basic research. And so the U.S. could both advance the global rate of growth as well as the growth by U.S. companies by investing further in basic research and making those research results available to American companies to give them the chance to build on that. And we see this in the drug sector, where companies are able to take advantage of research by the National Institutes of Health and then actually come up with a drug that works based on that basic research. That model has sustained us ever since the United States started the agricultural experiment stations back in the mid-19th century, and it should still sustain us today. You can do that without picking a champion, but you can give them a richer pool of fish to fish from. So those would be, and then the last thing I guess I would say is, from an intellectual property perspective, there is this open question of whether U.S. companies can recover for foreign infringement of their innovations if there's domestic liability. And I think Congress should make it absolutely clear in a global market that if there's been domestic infringement, you can recover for sales abroad, make it easier and cheaper for us to take advantage of our comparative advantage in innovation. Those are things I think that an economist would say about these policy questions.
Right, so Megan, what about that? I mean, it sounds like Dr. Putnam's got a couple of ideas here that have some resonance. And Judge Rader raised this issue of 5G standards, right? And the idea that in a lot of ways the Chinese have set the standards because Huawei helps set the standards because they're there. They're creating innovation. They're creating new technology. They're at the table. What is our role? What role can the government play? Are some of Dr. Putnam's ideas ones that are consistent with yours? The idea of sort of investing in more basic research, right? This idea of standards. Like, where can the U.S. government play in a way that's helpful and doesn't create the counterproductive concerns that you raised earlier?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. I think on the R&D and sort of the question of the U.S. subsidizing basic research, one of the challenges that I see popping up right now is the federal government has many 5G test beds that it is kicking off. And some of those are academic and not very real world. And it's one thing to build a 5G network on paper or use, in a virtual setting, but you actually need to get your hands dirty with the carriers. And so I haven't seen enough collaborative impulse by places like NIST, Idaho National Labs, DOD, to make sure that that research is relevant and isn't just sort of from the sidelines picking and identifying problems, right? If you're talking about that kind of collaborative research, roll up your sleeves. Lots of issues with that, legal IP, the whole thing, but that's an area where the government needs to be careful not to waste a bunch of money on R&D that might not be real world applicable and that might not have the benefit of the expertise. On the tech sector, on the tech standards side, this is one of the examples I use of sort of myths almost driving bad policy, right? There's this idea that China manipulates 3GPP or is driving this, has too many seats at the table. And if you look at the contributions and sort of how 3GPP, for example, operates, which for those who don't know, it's the sort of private sector led global body that is generating the technological standards for 5G telecommunications. And it benefits from everybody feeding into it. I've looked at the numbers of contributions. AT&T put out a policy paper that disabuses the idea that China is manipulating 3GPP. But the fear of that and the constant repetition of that has resulted in proposals like DOD saying they want to participate directly in 3GPP. Well, that's just not how it works. Like, they can go and influence the ITU, which is a treaty-based organization at which the government has a seat, and they do. But the idea that DOD is going to show up at 3GPP meetings and start to, influence those standards, that's just a mismatch. And I think that's where I get worried that you have these impulses to jump in and fix, and they may lead to bad policy, as just one example. So from the tech side, the standard side, the federal government has a role to play. They do. NIST and Commerce are there. They can do more, I think. And we've talked to the government for a couple of years about this. Convening more U.S. businesses to show up at these events. This is not always a priority for folks other than the Qualcomms, AT&Ts, Microsofts, but bringing more U.S. companies and Western allied companies to these fora would be a very useful thing that the U.S. government could do. I do not think they need to show up as the government, qua government, to try and tweak the standards.
Yeah, Judge Rader, what do you think about that? Does that make sense? This idea that the U.S. government really doesn't have a role to play. We should leave it in the private sector's hands, and that maybe the way to do it is to have them bring this in. You've made the point that it's really the Chinese that are playing a role because they have a role to play there because they've been doing the innovation. Should the U.S. government get more involved here, at least in bringing in more of the American private sector to play a bigger role?
No, this isn't government activity. This is innovation, which by definition is not done by governments. Government in the United States has hampered that by its patent policies. That Dr. Putnam made a good point, that the way innovation advances is through innovative theoretical research, which is disclosed and then converted into usable technology. That we call the patent system. And the United States has hampered both its software technology industry and its biotechnology diagnostics with recent court opinions not following the statute, which have made it harder and in fact impossible in some areas to disclose your technology in the US, which has in turn given an advantage to foreign industries, China and Europe alike, to move ahead of us in some of those key areas of technology. The only other thing I'd mention is the Chinese president, President Xi, gives a speech every 6 months on innovation. The courts there, they've created, in the last 3 years, they've created 27 new IP courts with expert judges that handle more IP cases than the rest of the world combined. The attention to innovation pervades their economy, from the tiny little companies that do low quality research that Dr. Putnam refers to the Huawei's. They are just pervaded by this sense of the importance of innovation, which I hear it in academic conferences like this. I do not hear it in our US technology sectors outside of that.
Yeah. So Dr. Putnam, what about that? Does the data prove that out, that really what's happening here is that there's just all this innovation going on, and that yes, there might be a lot of patents because there's a big emphasis on innovation, and yes, some of them might be low quality, but there's really a big chunk of their patents are high quality patents. There's these specialized courts now that are very good at this stuff. They're not there just to help the Chinese companies enforce their own patents, but to help them get to good patents. Does that sound right to you? And does the data prove that out, Dr. Putnam?
Well, I mean,
Let me point out, I didn't say that.
Well, sorry. Okay,
Yeah, I didn't
please
say
reframe.
that. So you, but we'll go ahead and let Dr. Putnam respond to that.
Well, yes. So I would agree. That's not exactly what Judge Rader said. I think it's actually hard to generalize because China does have significant sectors where they're pouring in a lot of real resources and they are serious threats. It's like aircraft carriers. They built an aircraft carrier. They can do it. Okay. They didn't steal the aircraft carrier technology. They built one. And then they're going to build another one, and they're building missiles, and they're,
Well, there might be some debate on that.
Well, all I'm saying is, I'm not saying, okay, fine. That's actually the point, is it's hard to generalize about, you can point to thefts, those are true. You can point to lots of R&D, that's also true. And so I don't think we should minimize the genuine competitive threat that China poses as a competitor in the world economy. Even if there were no questions about their motives or no issues of theft, we should be looking at them with cold and clear eyes about what they're doing, because they're smart people. There's a lot of, as Judge Rader said, there's 50,000 Huawei engineers. There's no way you can look at that and not say this is going to be an issue for the next century. And I think we should respond to it that way. That being said,
yeah,
well,
no, keep going.
All I'm saying is that in addition to that, if we're going to look at that as a country, I think we should look at it as being what is within a federal system like we have, a Republican system, what is the legitimate role of government so that the nation responds in the way that a nation can, as the federal government responds at a national level while preserving the things that we also don't have that China doesn't have, like individual freedom and the lack of coercion and the opportunity to earn the rewards of innovation in the private sector. That's a genuine and difficult question that ultimately goes beyond economics, because it's not just about economic competition. It's really about what kind of society are you building.
Yeah. So, Judge Rader, I want to give you a chance to correct the record on my characterization, what you said, and then second,
No,
as
I
you're
want
doing
to
that,
say how much I endorse what Dr. Putnam said. I think he hit it right on the head, that we need to build our own competitive innovation technology sector. We have the advantage, I think, that's implicit in what Dr. Putnam's saying, in that our innovation goes down to the garage inventors. Throughout the sector, we're not reliant just on 50,000 engineers in a very high technology center in Shanghai with Huawei. We have kind of a pervasive innovation throughout our economy, but we have to preserve those incentives through the patent system, through the regulatory system. I think Dr. Brown was talking about that. All of these things we need to be a little bit more attuned to than we have been in the past. And so I very much like Dr. Putnam's statement. And
so
Dr.
Megan,
Brown's too.
Yeah. So Megan, what about that? I mean, it sounds like you and Judge Rader might agree on this, and I want to bring Andy into the conversation too and get his thoughts on this. But it sounds like you all might agree on the right, and Dr. Putnam even at some level on this idea that, and again, I want to be careful characterizing what people have said, but this idea, I think I heard it right, that the real focus should be less on China and what they're doing and focus on America and make sure that we're not stifling innovation and that we've got the right policy in place to actually promote innovation, and that in our effort to address what we see as the potential threat from China competitively or national security wise, that the better approach is to go back to what we've always done, which is allow the American private sector to foster that innovation.
Yeah,
Megan?
I mean, I think that to me is the imperative for all policymakers, and I think it's a question that doesn't get asked enough when you're looking at whether it's a legislative proposal, whether you're looking at recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, whether you're looking, quite frankly, at this antitrust revisiting or the debates over Section 230. Right? I don't know that we're stopping and taking. I would be very curious for Andy's perspective, having been, in the Hill, sort of thinking with these policymakers. why that to me should be one of the first questions out of a policy that pops into a policymaker's mind when we're thinking, should the government invest in a test bed? Should we ban this product? Should we do this or that? Is this going to preserve and promote innovation in the US economy, and not just for the large established players, but throughout the economy? And you could identify a few key principles that could guide regulatory responses to this. Things like preserving public-private partnerships as a preferable alternative to regulation, avoiding duplicative federal activity, avoiding state duplicative activity, harmonizing these, but I don't see policymakers asking that enough right at the outset when you're looking at any of these hot button issues, to say, are we protecting the American innovation system, which I think is ultimately, the best way to combat the legitimate competitive threat from Chinese innovation or from other country innovation, right? We made certain choices about our regulatory environment. We now have the Google, Apple, Facebooks. Europe made different policy choices. They don't have those. So let's stop and think before we move ahead with any changes, and ask what's going to promote innovation when we face these very clear competitive global competitors.
Yeah, and so Andy, there's actually a question for the audience that I think bears on this question, right? As you start thinking about a legislative framework that might address some of this IP, these IP issues and protection of American IP, Megan and Judge Rader and Dr. Putnam have laid out a strong argument that, we've been doing it pretty well historically. Is now really the time to get involved in a big regulatory way? But Congress is thinking about these things. There's a lot of provisions that have already been in place. Megan referred to a couple of them, including 889. But now we're looking at new proposals in NDA. You and I have been supportive of those type of proposals in the past. You've written a paper on this. Megan's written a paper on public-private partnerships for NSI. Talk to us about what a legislative framework might look like. And then I want to sort of go around the horn and see what folks' thoughts on that are. And then, by the way, for the audience, if you do have questions, now's the time to hop in. We've got about 12 minutes left. So if you've got questions, throw them in the chat box. I'll try to get to them. Andy, legislative framework, thoughts?
Sure. So I think policymakers start with the economic question that we're discussing, right? I saw a report: 1 in 5 U.S. companies say they've had IP stolen from China. So there's a concern there. $600 billion in annual losses, 2 million jobs. So I think they start there and begin to work backwards. We can't be in a position where we just bleed everything that we have value as the economy moves more into an innovation-based, data-heavy economy, right? Our value is not the stuff we make; it's the intellectual property we bring to the equation, the innovation we bring to the equation. And if we just hand that off to our primary geopolitical competitor, who is then taking that cash, reinvesting it in the type of technologies development that the judge and Dr. Putnam are discussing, well, that's not a great place to be. And some of those innovations are finding their way into places like Hong Kong and Shenzhen, which has raised real concern from around the world, particularly from the Germans. You see a lot of concern in India now, based, in part based on this border skirmish they had, but they've banned several Chinese apps and are looking at expunging Huawei as well. The Japanese have really turned the corner on this question. SoftBank has refused to fund any Huawei projects. Companies like NEC carefully raise a lot of these concerns. So I actually disagree that it's strictly a U.S. government question. And I think it's one that a global consensus is coming around in much of the world. Much of the world that we see. And in the U.S., on the company side, I want to make this point. There are U.S.-based technology companies who refuse to do business in China for this very reason. Companies like Oracle, companies, and then I think of the famous, I testified on the Hill on this, the famous Cisco router case, where the router that made Cisco what it was copied by Huawei, copied down to the typos in the manual, all the source code, everything to the typos in the manual. So respectfully disagree on that point.
Well, but Andy, to Judge Rader's point, I mean, even if we accept that's true, right? That's a long time ago, right? Those Cisco routers are probably no longer in use, right? What do you? I do want to sort of hammer on this question because I want to get Judge Rader and Dr. Putnam and Megan's views on these questions. What about what Congress should do tomorrow. If you could have anything you want out of Congress tomorrow, what does that look like? And I'd love to get the rest of the panel's thoughts on that.
Sure, I'll try to go quick on this. Sorry for the diatribe earlier. So I think there's a couple of avenues, and I totally actually agree with all of the rest of the panelists that we need to be very careful on the instruments we use here. The ideas of industrial policy can be concerning, though my only pushback there is if your primary geopolitical competitor on the planet is fully embraced of this strategy and we're nowhere to be found, that's probably not a great place either. So, I think of legislative items like the CHIPS Act, right? So this is legislation, bipartisan legislation in the Senate, with some efforts in the House as well, that would provide billions of dollars in research and development to provide incentives for domestic manufacturing of semiconductors, right? Semiconductors are so critical to all of the future technologies that we care about, both on the economic and the military side. So something like that, while we are smart about allowing U.S. companies to export to some Chinese companies who have direct military intelligence ties that are a clear national security threat.
Yeah. So, Dr. Putnam, that sounds like, at least the CHIPS Act sounds like something you might be supportive of, sort of basic research, basic R&D, funding from the U.S. government. I know that's only one piece of the CHIPS Act, but obviously critical area semiconductors. We know that the vast majority of the world's semiconductors, while many of them may be designed here, are actually manufactured and fabbed in South Korea, Taiwan, and increasingly in China. Is this one way to address those concerns that you might be supportive of?
The short answer is yes. And the longer answer is that as long as U.S. labor costs are higher than elsewhere in the world, manufacturing is going to shift outside the U.S. Right. And or you need a sufficiently sophisticated technology that you need a more educated than average labor force. So I would say that focusing on chips is good, but focusing on sort of next generation computing technologies is actually even better. So we're tending to reach some of the physical limits on semiconductors. And I would be asking myself, what is the next thing after semiconductors? That's really the level at which the United States should be thinking about this and saying, we want to control the development of the next generation, not try to get down to 1 nanometer from 2 nanometers, because that's a game we can't win because we're not manufacturing there. And what you end up trying to, license the technology for fabs in Taiwan, and it's just, it's not a winning game for us, really. We could do better at it. We don't get compensated enough for the technology we develop. But what we really should be doing is inventing the next generation of technology, put the pedal to the metal and say, we're going to leave you in the rearview mirror. That's really what we ought to be doing, I think.
So Judge Rader, I want to come to you, and then Megan, you're going to get the last word on this. So Judge Rader, thoughts on the legislative framework and Dr. Putnam's point about how we ought to approach this from a competitive perspective?
Many decades ago, I worked in the House Appropriations and Ways and Means Committees, and I learned then that government-funded research was in almost every sector less than 10% of the actual innovation dollar, the actual research and development. So I think the real key is to unlock the incentives of our patent system, reverse some of the poor judicial decisions that have hampered our software and our biotechnology industries, and ensure that those incentives unlock the 90% of our innovation dollar that really matters when we compete in the world.
Great. Megan, you have the last word. And if you have a few seconds, we do have a question about H-1B visas, but I really want you to focus on this legislative question about 5G and IoT and whether there's a space here for the government to do something that's useful and not counterproductive, as you've repeatedly raised. So thoughts?
To me, the biggest way the government can be a help is to think about how it can learn where it can be most helpful. I think that you see in the rulemaking for export controls on emerging technologies, sometimes it feels like the government doesn't have a pulse on what the next big thing is, to the point that Dr. Putnam made. So I'd be thinking, before I plunk down, $800 billion and how can you create an environment where the innovators in our economy can talk to policymakers in a way that is not scary, is not going to get them screamed at or in trouble, but so that the government can understand where the trends are, so it can put its money in a sensible place. Otherwise, I feel like your policymakers are inherently going to be sort of looking in the rearview mirror at what's gone before. But I think that's a fundamental problem we have, is this inability for the policymakers to talk to the tech sector and understand what the heck is even going on, to then evaluate what makes sense for us to do, right? So some regulatory humility and maybe doubling down on collaboration and partnership in a non-regulatory, non-scary way.
Yeah. How do we create that regulatory safe space? What does that even look like? Are there models we can look at for that? I know we tried to do that in cybersecurity arena with information sharing, and it has not been successfully. Andy and I spent a lot of time working on that.
I mean, I think part of it is it's trust between the folks who are making the policy and the innovators. There's right now some skepticism among certain parts. It happens to get very political very quickly, which is unfortunate. I don't have a silver bullet here on how you snap your fingers and make the innovation economy comfortable talking to OSTP or whomever, but I think we need to find a place where those conversations can happen. And I don't know that it's in the traditional trade association model that we all are familiar with and love, but that's where I think some creativity needs to be brought to bear on how do we get those conversations happening in a way that doesn't threaten your IP, that doesn't subject you to FOIA, that doesn't mean some congressman's going to subpoena what you're doing, where we can actually have those discussions.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Megan. And thanks to the entire panel, Andy, Dr. Putnam, Judge Rader. Thank you guys so much for being here. Really great conversation. I want to thank all of you for doing this. For folks in the audience, if you have additional questions or want to learn more about CPIP or NSI, you can visit our respective websites. For NSI, you can register for our events or read one of our papers, including papers written by Megan Brown on public-private partnerships and by Andy Kaiser on 5G. You can visit us at nsi.gmu.edu. Reminder, if you want to get CLE credit for today's sessions, be sure to use the code RMJ Leader. It's in the chat box too, if you're looking at there. Thanks again for joining us for this incredible conference. Thanks to CPIP for the partnership. And please stick around for some concluding remarks from Joshua Koresh and Sean O'Connor.